Hello everyone, and welcome to a new video idea. Over the next couple of months, I'll be reading a book called The Secret War by Max Hastings. Depending on the feedback, I might end up just stopping, or I might fully finish the book, and I will also change kind of the length of the video and the organization of the videos. Each chapter is about the same length, or if not longer than this first introduction video or like prologue. And so depending on everyone's feedback, I will see kind of if we should do it just by sections in a chapter or the entire chapter as a video or like episode. The entire book is about 21 chapters long, and it has about 51 sections over the entire course. And so, depending on your choice, it can either be 51 separate videos or 21 separate videos. I would also be including all of these videos into one long playlist titled by the same name as the book and the author. And I might even consider, for whoever desires it, to make a singular long compilation video, which would just basically combine all of the episodes and all the chapters of the book into one really long video and just cutting out every introduction and making it one very, very long audiobook for your enjoyment. I will add more details and explanations at the end of the video for those that want to stick around and listen to that. That is enough of me adding context, and enjoy the prologue. The Secret War by Max Hastings. Introduction. This is a book about some of the most fascinating people who participated in the Second World War. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, civilians had vastly different experiences, forged by fire, geography, economics, and ideology. Those who killed each other were the most conspicuous, but in many ways, the least interesting. Outcomes were also profoundly influenced by a host of men and women who never fired a shot. While even in Russia, months could elapse between big battles, all the participants waged an unceasing secret war, a struggle for knowledge of the enemy to empower their armies, navies, and air forces through espionage and codebreaking. Lieutenant General Albert Braun, the Wehrmacht's last signals chief, wrote afterwards of the latter. All aspects of this modern Cold War of the airwaves were carried on constantly, even when the guns were silent. The Allies also launched guerrilla and terrorist campaigns wherever, in Axis-occupied territories, they had the means to do so. Covert operations assumed an unprecedented importance. This book does not aspire to be a comprehensive narrative, which would fill countless volumes. It is instead a study of both sides' secret war machines and some of the characters who influenced them. It is unlikely that any more game-changing revelations will be forthcoming, save possibly from Soviet archives currently locked by Vladimir Putin. The Japanese destroyed most of their intelligence files in 1945, and what survives remains inaccessible in Tokyo, but veterans provided significant post-war testimony. A decade ago, I interviewed some of them myself. Most books about wartime intelligence focus on the doings of a chosen nation. I have instead attempted to explore it in a global context. Some episodes in my narrative are bound to be familiar to specialists, but a new perspective seems possible by placing them on a broad canvas. Though Spies and Codebreakers have generated a vast literature, readers may be as astonished by some of the tales in this book as I have been on discovering them myself. I have written extensively about the Russians because their doings are much less familiar to Western readers than are those of Britain's Bletchley Park, America's Arlington Hall, and Op 20G. I have omitted many legends and made no attempt to retell the most familiar tales of resistance in Western Europe, nor of the Abwehr's agents in Britain and America, who were swiftly imprisoned or turned for the famous double-cross system. By contrast, though the facts of Richard Sorge's and Cicero's doings have been known for many decades, their significance deserves a rethink. The achievements of some secret warriors were as breathtaking as the blunders of others. As I recount here, the British several times allowed sensitive material to be captured, which could have been fatal to the ultra-secret. Meanwhile, spy writers dwell obsessively on the treachery of Britain's Cambridge Five, but relatively few recognize what we might call the Washington and Berkeley 500, a small army of American leftists who served as informants for Soviet intelligence. The egregious Senator Joseph McCarthy stigmatized many individuals unjustly, but he was not wrong in charging that between the 1930s and 1950s, the U.S. government and the nation's greatest institutions and corporations harbored an astonishing number of employees whose first loyalty was not to their own flag. True, between 1941 and 1945, the Russians were supposedly allies of Britain and the United States, but Stalin viewed this relationship with unremitting cynicism as a merely temporary association for the narrow purpose of destroying the Nazis with nations that remained the Soviet Union's historic foes and rivals. Many books about wartime intelligence focus on what spies or codebreakers found out. The only question that matters, however, is how far secret knowledge changed outcomes. The scale of Soviet espionage dwarfed that of every other belligerent, and yielded a rich technological harvest from Britain and the United States. But Stalin's paranoia crippled exploitation of his crop of other people's political and military secrets. The most distinguished American historian of wartime codebreaking told me in 2014 that after half a lifetime studying the subject, he has decided that Allied intelligence contributed almost nothing to winning the war. This seems too extreme a verdict, but my friend's remarks show how skepticism, and indeed cynicism, breed and multiply in the course of decades, wading in the morass of fantasy, treachery, and incompetence wherein most spy masters and their servants have their being. The record suggests that official secrecy does more to protect intelligence agencies from domestic accountability for their own follies than to shield them from enemy penetration. Of what use was it, for instance, to conceal from the British public even the identities of their own spy chiefs, when for years MI6's most secret operations were betrayed to the Russians by Kim Philby, one of their most senior officers? The US government repudiated a bilateral intelligence exchange agreed with the NKVD by Major General William Donovan of OSS. But official caution did little for national security when some of Donovan's top subordinates were passing secrets to Soviet agents. Intelligence gathering is not a science. There are no certainties, even when some of the enemy's correspondence is being read. There is a cacophony of noise from which signals, truths, large and small, must be extracted. In August 1939, on the eve of the Nazi-Soviet pact, a British official wrung his hands over the confused messages reaching the Foreign Office about relations between Berlin and Moscow. "We find ourselves," he wrote, using words that may be applied to most intelligence, "when attempting to assess the value of these secret reports, somewhat in the position of the captain of the 40 thieves when, having put a chalk mark on Ali Baba's door, he found that Morgana had put similar chalk marks on all the doors in the street and had no indication which was the true one." It is fruitless to study any nation's successes, its pearls of revelation, in isolation. These must be viewed in the context of hundreds of thousands of pages of trivia or outright nonsense that cross the desks of analysts, statesmen, commanders. Diplomats and intelligence agents, in my experience, are even bigger liars than journalists, wrote the British wartime spy Malcolm Muggeridge, who was familiar with all three, and something of a charlatan himself. The sterility of much espionage was nicely illustrated by František Moravec of Czech intelligence. One day in 1936, he proudly presented his commanding officer with a report on a new piece of German military equipment, for which he had paid an informant handsomely. The general skimmed it, then said, "I will show you something better." He tossed across his desk a copy of the magazine Die Wehrmacht, pointed out an article on the same weapon and said dryly the subscription is only 20 crowns. In the same category fell the Abwehr transcript of a December 1944 U.S. State Department message appointing a new economic affairs counselor to the Polish exile government in London. This read, in part, his transportation expenses and per diem Tunis to London via Washington, D.C., transportation effects and per diem for his family and shipment effects direct authorized, subject travel regulations. A page-long translation of this decrypt was stamped top secret by its German readers. The man-hours expended by the Nazi war machine to secure this gem reflects the fashion in which intelligence services often move mountains to give birth to mice. Trust is a bond and privilege of free societies. Yet credulity and respect for privacy are fatal flaws to analysts and agent runners. Their work requires them to persuade citizens of other countries to abandon their traditional idea of patriotism, whether for cash, out of conviction, or occasionally because of a personal bond between handler and informant. It will always be disputed territory, whether those who betray their society's secrets are courageous and principled heroes who identify a higher loyalty, as modern Germans perceive the anti-Hitler resistance, or instead traitors, as most of us classify Kim Philby, Alger Hiss, and, in our own times, Edward Snowden. The day job of many intelligence officers is to promote treachery, which helps to explain why the trade attracts so many weird people. Malcolm Muggeridge asserted disdainfully that it necessarily involves such cheating, lying, and betraying that it has a deleterious effect on the character. I never met anyone professionally engaged in it whom I should care to trust in any capacity. Stalin said, "A spy should be like the devil. No one can trust him, not even himself." The growth of new ideologies, most significantly communism, caused some people to embrace loyalties that crossed frontiers and, in the eyes of zealots, transcended mere patriotism. More than a few felt exalted by discovering virtue in treason, though others preferred to betray for cash. Many wartime spy masters were uncertain which side their agents were really serving, and in some cases bewilderment persists to this day. The British petty cook Eddie Chapman, Agent Zigzag, had extraordinary war experiences as the plaything of British and German intelligence. At different times, he put himself at the mercy of both, but it seems unlikely that his activities did much good to either. He was an intriguing but unimportant figure, one among countless loose cannons on the secret battlefield. More interesting, and scarcely known to the public, is the case of Ronald Seth, an SOE agent captured by the Germans and trained by them to serve as a double in Britain. I shall describe below the puzzlement of SOE, MI5, MI6, MI9, and the Abwehr about whose side Seth ended up on. Intelligence gathering is inherently wasteful. I am struck by the number of Secret Service officers of all nationalities whose only achievement in foreign postings was to stay alive, at a hefty cost to their employers, while collecting information of which not a smidgen assisted in the war effort. Perhaps 1,000th of a 1% of material garnered from secret sources by all the belligerents in World War II contributed to changing battlefield outcomes. Yet that fraction was of such value that warlords grudged not a life nor pound, ruble, dollar, Reichsmark expended in securing it. Intelligence has always influenced wars, but until the 20th century, commanders could discover their enemies' motions only through spies and direct observation, counting men, ships, guns. Then came wireless communication, which created rolling new intelligence corn prairies that grew exponentially after 1930 as technology advanced. There has never been anything comparable in any other period of history to the impact of radio, wrote the great British scientific intelligence officer Dr. R.V. Jones. It was the product of some of the most imaginative developments that have ever occurred in physics, and it was as near magic as anyone could conceive. Not only could millions of citizens build their own sets at home, as did also many spies abroad, but in Berlin, London, Washington, Moscow, Tokyo, electronic eavesdroppers were empowered to probe the deployments and sometimes the intentions of an enemy without benefit of telescopes, frigates, or agents. One of the themes in this book is that the signals intelligence war, certainly in its early stages, was less lopsided in the Allies' favor than popular mythology suggests. The Germans used secret knowledge well to plan the 1940 invasion of France and the Low Countries. At least until mid-1942, and even in some degree thereafter, they read important Allied codes both on land and at sea, with significant consequences for both the Battle of the Atlantic and the North Africa campaign. They were able to exploit feeble Red Army wireless security during the first year of Operation Barbarossa. From late 1942 onwards, however, Hitler's codebreakers lagged even further behind their Allied counterparts. The Abwehr's attempts at espionage abroad were pitiful. The Japanese government and Army High Command planned their initial 1941-42 assaults on Pearl Harbor and the European empires of Southeast Asia most efficiently, but thereafter treated intelligence with disdain and waged war in a fog of ignorance about their enemies' doings. The Italian intelligence service and its codebreakers had some notable successes in the early war years, but by 1942, Mussolini's commanders were reduced to using Russian POWs to do their eavesdropping on Soviet wireless traffic. Relatively little effort was expended by any nation on probing Italy's secrets, because its military capability shrank so rapidly. Our picture of the Italian Air Force was incomplete and our knowledge far from sound, admitted RAF intelligence officer Group Captain Harry Humphreys about the Mediterranean theater. Before adding smugly, so, fortunately, was the Italian Air Force. The first requirement of successful use of secret data is that commanders should be willing to analyze it honestly. Herbert Mayer, a veteran of Washington's National Intelligence Council, defined his business as the presentation of organized information. He argued that ideally, intelligence departments should provide a service for commanders resembling that of ship and aircraft navigation systems. Donald McLachlan, a British naval practitioner, observed, "Intelligence has much in common with scholarship, and the standards which are demanded in scholarship are those which should be applied to intelligence." After the war, the surviving German commanders blamed all their intelligence failures on Hitler's refusal to countenance objective assessment of evidence. Signal Supremo Albert Braun said, "Unfortunately, throughout the war, Hitler showed a lack of confidence in communications intelligence, especially if the reports were unfavorable to his own views." Good news for the Axis cause, for instance, interceptions revealing heavy Allied losses, were given the highest priority for transmission to Berlin, because the Führer welcomed them. Meanwhile, bad tidings received short shrift. Before the June 1941 invasion of Russia, General Georg Thomas of the Wehrmacht, the Wehrmacht's economic department, produced estimates of Soviet weapons production which approached the reality, though still short of it, and argued that the loss of European Russia would not necessarily precipitate the collapse of Stalin's industrial base. Hitler dismissed Thomas's numbers out of hand, because he could not reconcile their magnitude with his contempt for all things Slavonic. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel eventually instructed the Wehrmacht to stop submitting intelligence that might upset the Führer. The war effort of the Western democracies profited immensely from the relative openness of their societies and governance. Churchill sometimes indulged spasms of anger towards those around him who voiced unwelcome views, but a remarkably open debate was sustained in the Allied corridors of power, including most military headquarters. General Sir Bernard Montgomery was a considerable tyrant, but those whom he trusted, including his intelligence chief Brigadier Bill Williams, a peacetime Oxford Don, could speak their minds. All the United States' brilliant intelligence successes were gained through codebreaking, and were exploited most dramatically in the Pacific Naval War. American ground commanders seldom showed much interest in using their intelligence to promote deceptions, as did the British. D-Day in 1944 was the only operation for which the Americans cooperated wholeheartedly on a deception plan. Even then, the British were prime movers, while the Americans merely acquiesced, for instance allowing General George Patton to masquerade as commander of the fictitious American 1st U.S. Army Group supposedly destined to land in Pas-de-Calais. Some senior Americans were suspicious of the British enthusiasm for misleading the enemy, which they regarded as reflecting their allies' enthusiasm for employing guile to escape hard fighting, the real business of war. GC&CS, the so-called Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, was of course not merely the most important intelligence hub of the conflict, but from 1942, Britain's outstanding contribution to victory. Folk legend holds that Alan Turing's creation of electromechanical bombs exposed Germany's entire communication system to Allied eyes by breaking the Enigma's traffic. The truth is far more complex. The Germans employed dozens of different keys, many of which were read only intermittently, often out of real time, meaning insufficiently rapidly to make possible any operational response, and a few not at all. The British accessed some immensely valuable Enigma material, but coverage was never remotely comprehensive and was especially weak on army traffic. Moreover, an ever-increasing volume of the Germans' most secret signals were transmitted through a teleprinter network which employed an entirely different encryption system from that used by Enigma. The achievement of Bletchley's mathematicians and linguists in cracking the Lorenz-Schlüsselsatz was quite distinct from, and more difficult than, breaking the Enigma, even though recipients in the field knew the products of all such activities simply as ultra. Bull Tut, the young Cambridge mathematician who made the critical initial discoveries, is scarcely known to posterity, yet deserves to be almost as celebrated as Turing. Ultra enabled the Allied leadership to plan its campaigns and operations in the second half of the war with a confidence vouchsafed to no previous warlords in history. Knowing the enemy's hand did not diminish its strength, however. In 1941 and into 1942, again and again, the British learned where the Axis intended to strike, as in Crete, North Africa, and Malaya. But this did not save them from losing the subsequent battles. Hard power, whether on land or at sea or in the air, was indispensable to the exploitation of secret knowledge. So too was wisdom on the part of British and American commanders and their staffs, which proved conspicuously lacking at key moments during the 1944-45 Northwest European campaign. Intelligence did, however, contribute importantly to mitigating some early disasters. Young R.V. Jones's achievement in showing the path towards jamming the Luftwaffe's navigational beams significantly diminished the pain inflicted by the Blitz on Britain. At sea, Ultra's pinpointing of German U-boats, with an alarming 9-month interruption in 1942, made it possible to reroute convoys to evade them, an even more important contribution to holding open the Atlantic supply line than sinking enemy submarines. The Americans had some reason to suspect their allies of romanticism about deception. Colonel Dudley Clark, famous not least to Spanish police, who once arrested him wearing women's clothing in a Madrid street, conducted a massive cover operation in the North African desert before the October 1942 Battle of El Alamein. Historians have celebrated Clark's ingenuity in creating fictional forces which caused Rommel to deploy significant strength well south of the focal point of Montgomery's assault. However, such guile did not spare 8th Army from the fortnight of hard fighting that proved necessary to break through the Afrika Korps. The Germans argued that Clark's activity changed nothing in the end, because they had time to redeploy northwards before the decisive British assault. In Burma, Colonel Peter Fleming, brother of the creator of James Bond, went to elaborate and hazardous lengths to leave a haversack full of deceptive secret papers in a wrecked jeep where the enemy were bound to find it. But the Japanese took no notice of this haul when they got it. From 1942 onwards, British intelligence achieved an almost complete understanding of Germany's air defenses and the electronic technologies they employed, but Allied bomber forces continued to suffer punitive casualties, especially before US long-range fighters wrecked the Luftwaffe in the air in the spring of 1944. Whatever the contribution of British tactical deceptions in North Africa, Allied deceivers had two important and almost indisputable strategic successes. In 1943-44, Operation Zeppelin created a fictitious British army in Egypt, which induced Hitler to maintain large forces in Yugoslavia and Greece to repel an Allied Balkan landing. It was this imaginary threat, not Tito's guerrillas, that caused 22 Axis divisions to kick their heels in the southeast until after D-Day. The second achievement was, of course, that of Operation Fortitude, before and after the assault on Normandy. It bears emphasis that neither could have exercised such influence had not the Allies possessed sufficient hard power, together with command of the sea, to make it credible that they might land armies almost anywhere. Some Russian deceptions dwarf those of the British and Americans. The story of Agent Max and the vast operation launched as a diversion from the Stalingrad offensive at a cost of 70,000 Russian lives is one of the most astonishing of the war and almost unknown to Western readers. In 1943-44, other Soviet ruses prompted the Germans repeatedly to concentrate their forces in the wrong place in advance of onslaughts by the Red Army. Air superiority was an essential prerequisite, in the East as in the West. The ambitious deceptions of the later war years were possible only because the Germans could not carry out photographic reconnaissance to disprove the legends they were sold across the airwaves and through false documents. The Western Allies were much less successful in gathering HUMINT than SIGINT. Neither the British nor the Americans acquired a single highly placed source around the German, Japanese, or Italian governments or high commands until in 1943, OSS's Alan Dulles began to receive some good Berlin gossip. The Western Allies achieved nothing like the Russians' penetration of London, Washington, Berlin, and Tokyo, the last through their agent Richard Sorge, working in the German embassy. The US got into the business of overseas espionage only after Pearl Harbor, and focused more effort on sabotage and code-breaking than on placing spies, as distinct from paramilitary groups, in enemy territory. OSS's research and analyst department in Washington was more impressive than its flamboyant but unfocused field operations. Moreover, I believe that Western Allied sponsorship of guerrilla war did more to promote the post-war self-respect of occupied nations than to hasten the destruction of Nazism. Russia's partisan operations were conducted on a far more ambitious scale than the SOE-OSS campaigns, and propaganda boosted their achievements both at the time and in the post-war era. However, Soviet documents now available, of which my Russian researcher Dr. Lyuba Vinogradovna has made extensive use, indicate that we should view the achievements of the Eastern Guerrilla Campaign, at least until 1943, with considerable skepticism. As in all my books, I seek below to establish the big picture framework and to weave into this human stories of the spies, codebreakers, and intelligence chiefs who served their respective masters. Turing at Bletchley and Nimitz's cryptanalysts in the Pacific, the Soviet Red Orchestra of agents in Germany, Reinhard Gehlen of OKH, William Donovan of OSS, and many more exotic characters. The foremost reason the Western Allies did intelligence best was that they brilliantly exploited civilians, to whom both the US and British governments granted discretion, influence, and, where necessary, military rank, as their opponents did not. When the first volume of the British official history of wartime intelligence was published 30 years ago, I suggested to its principal author, Professor Harry Hinsley, a Bletchley veteran, that it seemed to show that the amateurs contributed more than did career Secret Service professionals. Hinsley replied somewhat impatiently, "Of course they did. You wouldn't want to suppose, would you, that in peacetime the best brains of our society wasted their lives in intelligence? I have always thought this an important point, echoed in the writings of another academic, Hugh Trevor Roper, who served in both MI5 and MI6, and whose personal achievement makes him seem one of the more remarkable British intelligence officers of the war. In peacetime, most secret services fulfilled their functions adequately, or at least did little harm, while staffed by people of moderate abilities. Once the struggle for national survival began, however, intelligence had to become part of the guiding brain of the war effort. Clashes on the battlefield could be fought by men of relatively limited gifts, the virtues of the sports field: physical fitness, courage, grit, a little initiative, and common sense. But intelligence services suddenly needed brilliance. It sounds banal to say that they had to recruit intelligent people, but, as more than a few 20th century sages noted, in many countries this principle was honored mostly in the breach. A few words about the arrangement of this book. While my approach is broadly chronological, to avoid leaping too confusingly between traitors in Washington, Soviet spies in Switzerland, and the mathematicians of Bletchley Park, the narrative persists with some themes beyond their time sequence. I have drawn heavily on the most authoritative published works in this field, those of Stephen Bydyansky, David Kahn, and Christopher Andrew, notable among them, but I have also exploited archives in Britain, Germany, and the US, together with much previously untranslated Russian material. I have made no attempt to discuss the mathematics of code-breaking, which has been done by writers much more numerate than myself. It is often said that Ian Fleming's thrillers bear no relationship to the real world of espionage. However, when reading contemporary Soviet reports and recorded conversations, together with the memoirs of Moscow's wartime intelligence officers, I am struck by how uncannily they mirror the mad, monstrous, imagined dialogue of such people in Fleming's From Russia with Love. And some of the plots planned and executed by the NKVD and the GRU were no less fantastic than his. All historical narratives are necessarily tentative and speculative, but they become far more so when spies are involved. In chronicling battles, one can reliably record how many ships were sunk, aircraft shot down, men killed, how much ground was won or lost, but intelligence generates a vast, unreliable literature, some of it produced by protagonists for their own glorification or justification. One immensely popular account of Allied intelligence, Bodyguard of Lies, published in 1975, is largely a work of fiction. Sir William Stephenson, the Canadian who ran the British Wartime Intelligence Coordination Organization in New York, performed a valuable liaison function, but was never much of a spymaster. This did not prevent him from assisting in the creation of a wildly fanciful 1976 biography of himself, A Man Called Intrepid, though there is no evidence that anybody ever called him anything of the sort. Most accounts of wartime SOE agents, particularly women and especially in France, contain large doses of romantic twaddle. Moscow's mendacity is undiminished by time. The KGB's official intelligence history, published as recently as 1997, asserts that the British Foreign Office is still concealing documentation about its secret negotiations with fascist Germany and indeed its collusion with Hitler. Allied code-breaking operations against Germany, Italy, and Japan exercised far more influence than did any spy. It is impossible to quantify their impact, however, and it is baffling that Harry Hinsley, the official historian, asserted that Ultra probably shortened the war by 3 years. This is as tenditious as Professor M.R.D. Foote's claim in his official history of SOE in France that Allied commanders considered that resistance curtailed the global struggle by 6 months. Ultra was a tool of the British and Americans, who played only a subordinate role in the destruction of Nazism, which was overwhelmingly a Russian military endeavor. It is no more possible to measure the contribution of Bletchley Park to the timing of victory than that of Winston Churchill, Liberty ships, or radar. Likewise, publicists who make claims that some sensational modern book recounts the spy story that changed World War II might as well cite Mary Poppins. One of Churchill's most profound observations was made in October 1941, in response to a demand from Sir Charles Portal, as Chief of Air Staff, for a commitment to build 4,000 heavy bombers, which, claimed the airmen, would bring Germany to its knees in 6 months. The Prime Minister wrote back that, while everything possible was being done to create a large bomber force, he deplored attempts to place unbounded confidence in any one means of securing victory. All things are always on the move simultaneously, he declared. This is an immensely important comment on human affairs, especially in war and above all in intelligence. It is impossible justly to attribute all credit for the success or blame for the failure of an operation to any single factor. Yet while skepticism about the secret war is indispensable, so too is a capacity for wonder. Some fabulous tales prove true. I blush to remember the day in 1974 when I was invited by a newspaper to review F.W. Winterbotham's The Ultra Secret. In those days, young and green, and a mere casual student of 1939-45, like the rest of the world, I had never heard of Bletchley Park. I glanced at the about-to-be-published book, then declined to write about it. Winterbotham made such extraordinary claims that I could not credit them. Yet, of course, the author, a wartime officer of MI6, had been authorized to open a window upon one of the biggest and most fascinating secrets of the Second World War. No other nation has ever produced an official history explicitly dedicated to wartime intelligence, and approaching in magnitude Britain's 5 volumes and 3,000 plus pages, published between 1978 and 1990. This lavish commitment to the historiography of the period, funded by the taxpayer, reflects British pride in its achievement, sustained into the 21st century by such absurd, as defined by its negligible relationship to fact, yet also hugely successful feature films as 2014's The Imitation Game. While most educated people today recognize how subordinate was the contribution of Britain to Allied victory alongside those of the Soviet Union and the United States, they realize that here was something Churchill's people did better than anybody else. Although there are many stories in this book about bungles and failures, in intelligence, as in everything else related to the conflict, victory is gained not by the side that makes no mistakes, but by the one that makes fewer than the other side. By such a reckoning, the ultimate triumph of the British and Americans was as great in the secret war as it became in the collision between armies, navies, and air forces. The defining reality is that the Allies won. Finally, while some episodes described below seem comic or ridiculous and reflect human frailties and follies, we must never forget that in every aspect of the global conflict, the stakes were life and death. Hundreds of thousands of people of many nationalities risked their lives, and many sacrificed them, often in the loneliness of dawn before a firing squad, to gather intelligence or pursue guerrilla operations. No 21st century perspective on the personalities and events, successes and failures of those days should diminish our respect, even reverence, for the memory of those who paid the price for waging secret war. Max Hastings. Well, I hope you enjoyed that prologue to the book and the introduction to kind of this new series I'm going to make. And hopefully it gives you an idea of what's to come. I am welcoming any sort of feedback on this video, again, deciding on whether you want me to make 21 episodes or 51 episodes, by sections or by chapters, and then also sort of the pacing in general of the book. I would also love feedback on how often you would want me to post these, whether it's like a weekly thing or a monthly thing. So something like deciding whether it's a chapter a month or if you want it to be a section a week. However often you want these videos kind of to come out, and I will see what I can do to make that possible. I would also love feedback on the way this video has been made, whether it should include something like gameplay of some games I enjoy in the background while I'm reading the book, or whether it should stay this still image of the book cover. Either way, I appreciate any feedback you can give, and I will try to incorporate anything that I deem as a good idea or that is possible for me to do. And I want to say thank you for sticking around to the end of the video, as well as just sticking around on the channel. If this is the kind of content you enjoy, I'll probably be doing this for a while. I will likely read other books as well. And if you can give any recommendations for books that you would like to have read, I will also be looking for those as well. That marks the end of this prologue episode. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you next time as well.